delight to work with Jonathan, Samantha, and team on this PSI sponsored event. I'm chair of the granting agency at PSI just now. I've been with that group for quite a while and have been very impassioned by the mission of PSI, and so delighted that it could sponsor events like this. So I'm here to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Karen Burns. Dr. Burns is at the University of Toronto now. She practices in the intensive care unit there, has a cross appointment here at McMaster. She's an outstanding clinician and a beloved teacher. She's a gifted mentor and a brilliant scientist. She's going to tell us a little bit more about the engagement of patients and families in research. And she's done a lot of her own investigations, leading the way, showing all of us how we may do it more thoughtfully. And she also has major administrative responsibilities as running the Canadian Critical Care Society, where she has embraced some of the concepts she'll be discussing here, where she's been a champion of EDI through her leadership, through the science that she does, and in her teaching and day-to-day practice. She's a beautiful human being, and I know you're going to enjoy what she has to say, and you're sure to learn a lot. Nothing about us without us. Best practices from Dr. Burns.
So thank you to the organizers for the invitation to speak here today. I'm actually a mechanical ventilation researcher. That's what I do. I look at different ways of supporting patients on invasive mechanical ventilation and liberating them from the ventilator. But what I'm going to talk to you about is, I guess, a lot of what I've learned from patients and families who I've integrated in my research over the last 7 or 8 years. So I'm going to start just by going through some objectives, what I want to communicate with you today. I'd like to review some examples of engagement in research and how they've changed the process of research or outcomes. I'd like to review some evidence related to engagement in clinical research and in clinical trials specifically. I'd like to highlight some best practices for how to engage patients and families in research, examine a framework for organizational approaches to engagement, and highlight approaches and best practices for community engagement. Really, the history of engagement in Canada dates back to the late 1970s. And it really started with the HIV and AIDS community wanting to have a say in which studies were conducted and how they were conducted, specifically what research priorities existed in studying a new disease that people didn't know a lot about, and outcomes that were being measured in the clinical research. By 2000, about scientific organizations such as OMERACT, the Outcomes Measures and Rheumatology Group, had actively championed involving patients and families as research partners. And then more organizations began to include patients and family members in their research in about 2012 and forward. I was asked to talk about best practices. I just want to define best practices here. A best practice is an effective, standardized way of achieving goals or delivering results that can work in a range of settings. This is different from strategies or tactics. Strategies are plans that organizations use to achieve a particular facet of an overall goal. So things like fostering support from leadership. Tactics are the steps that we take to implement a strategy, such as gaining buy-in from clinicians or from researchers. So examples of research engagement. This is really kind of what sparked my interest in engaging patients and families in clinical trials. The earliest example that I could find was from OMERACT, and it dates back to 1992, when PRPs, our patient research partners, began to become involved with the OMERACT group. And these were largely patients that have rheumatoid arthritis, a common ailment in the community. And they were really advocating to refocus the research that was being done to look at the impact of fatigue in patients with rheumatoid arthritis. And they were highlighting how fatigue affects their everyday life. They wanted to really galvanize the research community to take note of this and to understand the impact of fatigue on their quality of life and their ability to function. And they wanted to understand, for the research community to understand that this should be an outcome that should be measured and reported. And now OMERACT endorses fatigue as a critical outcome in all of their research, and it's a mandatory outcome that gets reported in all of their trials. But OMERACT has gone really above and beyond that. They've changed the structure of their networks and their meetings to really actively engage patients and family members as participants. So if you're a patient research partner, you participate between their biannual meetings, you're often involved in reviewing protocols or in protocol implementation, even getting funding for protocols. And groups that present plenaries at the OMERACT meeting must fund at least one PRP to attend their meeting. And patients at the meetings have full voting rights, the same as clinicians and scientists. And above and beyond that, the PRPs are actually now formally organized within OMERACT. Each day, the organizers of the next day's sessions meet with the PRPs to explain to them what's on the program, what they hope to achieve that day in the program, what patients should look for, and how they can contribute to the next day's discussions. They've actually developed a formalized glossary of research terms that is now part of the core conference materials. They have lay summaries that are included, so not just the abstracts that researchers present, but actually you have to submit your lay abstract to the meeting if you're going to present at the meeting. And the PRPs themselves organize training to train the next generation of PRPs within OMERACT. So there's a formal structure, a train the trainer approach within OMERACT. And you can see on this diagram on the far right, we have the years 2002, which is when engagement began. This only goes up to 2016, but you can see the yellow lines increasing over time, and just depicting how deeply patients are integrated into the research production within OMERACT. And, you know, at the top, you can see that patients were first invited to the meeting. The patients were first invited to the meeting. And then you can see that as you go down, that they're executive committee members, and they're actually conducting seminars for patient representatives to carry forward. So the OMERACT example for me highlights the importance of education and training of patients to become partners in research. It also shows how attitudes of researchers, patient representatives, and organizations can create a culture in which partnerships actually can thrive and create a better end product. There's another example that sticks out in the literature to me, and that's the EULAR example, the European League Against Rheumatism. And this particular one relates to psoriatic arthritis and really focuses on developing instruments, both to be used clinically as well as in research. And you can see they went through a detailed process of instrument development. You know, patient representatives from 11 European countries participated in a meeting, which was led by a nurse researcher, to identify life impact domains in accordance with EULAR recommendations. This is 139 patients, and they prioritized 16 life impact domains. 65 patients then provided feedback on item wording on these questionnaires to evaluate psoriatic arthritis. Then they validated the instruments with new patients from 11 countries who completed the questionnaires and underwent a clinical examination. In the end, there was a debate about 3 items: embarrassment or shame related to having psoriatic arthritis, social participation, and depression. And some professionals and some patients questioned the added value of asking all patients in a clinical trial about these 3 items. And instead, their solution as a combined network was actually to develop 2 different tools. One was a 9-item tool that focused on objective measures that could be used in clinical trials. And the other was a 12-item tool that could be used by rheumatologists in clinical practice that included these 3 items. So you can see in this example how patient research partners work with clinicians and scientists to kind of advance not only the research agenda, but to actually advance the patient care agenda in clinical practice. And they published this table that showed their recommendations for including PRPs in research design or in scientific projects. They strongly recommended that PRPs participate in all clinical research projects and guidelines, that they should participate in all phases of research development. There should be a minimum of 2 PRPs per project. There should be a clear description of their expected contributions. They should be encouraged and helped to facilitate and contribute to the meeting as it's going on. And that it's the principal investigator's responsibility to ensure that they receive the appropriate training to be active discussants and participants in meetings. And in addition, they should be recognized, including co-authorship for their contributions. So for me, the EULAR example illustrated that patient research partners and researchers can collaborate to develop patient-centered instruments that are, helpful in both the research as well as in the clinical setting. They can obviously contribute at different phases of development, and the training that is provided actually enables the patient research partners to participate fully in these endeavors. In addition, it strengthened the measures that emerged. In this particular example, of both a clinical tool as well as a research tool emerged. And the attitudes of trust, respect, co-learning, co-creating, and reciprocity ultimately facilitated the partnership and the productivity. In my own weaning trials, and this is critical care, most of our patients are unconscious, but we engaged patients and family members. So patients for us are ICU survivors and family members of patients that were in the ICU, in helping us to design a factorial design weaning trial that looked at how we get patients off the ventilator. So this trial looked at 2 different ways of assessing when people are ready to breathe on their own, and 2 different ways of testing whether they're ready to breathe on their own. And this began in August of 2015. We had 3 ICU survivors, and we had 2 family members that participated. And this is them. They became very active participants. They were very educated on weaning. 2 of them have since died. Both Ken and George have passed away. But what did they do? During trial preparation, they helped us. They reviewed the trial protocol before we submitted it to a granting agency. They, in particular, liked the PCORI lay abstracts, and they found the PCORI grants were much easier to read than our CIHR grant. They provided letters of support, and the letters of support were impactful. They talked about their struggles getting off the ventilator and what it meant to them that we were doing research in this area. He reviewed 4 disability scales and selected the FIM, the Functional Independence Measure, at 6-month follow-up interviews to assess disability. One PFAC member sat on our steering committee, and another sat on our DSMB, and they made valuable contributions in both of those roles. They reviewed and they edited the follow-up interview transcripts. They even decided on what incentives we offered for people that were willing to participate in the 6-month follow-up. We were just going to offer a Starbucks card or a Tim Hortons card, and they said that means nothing to a single mom who's trying to raise her daughter and maybe needs diapers. You should find other internet-based gift cards that are available that are more meaningful for patient and family representatives. We posted their biographies on our microsite within the Canadian Critical Care Trials Group. We met with them Q3 monthly during the trial to update them. Every time we met with the steering committee, we updated them. We met with them. We discussed issues related to trial recruitment as well as study implementation, and there were many. Inability to leave messages, for example, was one key one for organizing the follow-up interviews, because we had to use a blocked number, and because there had been a television program on researchers contacting families and it being a hoax in Quebec. And so we had to work around, develop strategies. A lot of the strategies came from our patient and family advisors on how to navigate that difficult circumstance, and it included things like calling in advance, having the research coordinators call in advance to advise them when the research team would be calling. As I mentioned, they selected the incentives for participating in the follow-up studies, and they helped us develop a weaning brochure. Now that they understood mechanical ventilation and weaning, to make weaning simple and easy to understand for family members that were being approached for consent for their loved ones to participate in the trial. And they even developed a research participation brochure because they thought the research enterprise was very confusing, and actually it could be very simplified. So they developed those for the ICU waiting rooms to help family members understand. And this is an example of the weaning brochure. This is a copy in English, but included, what is weaning, what is screening, how is a spontaneous breathing trial performed. This is all their wording. They developed this and included pictures, et cetera, et cetera. We plan to involve them in trial dissemination. We're just writing up the trial manuscript now. There will be full authors on our final paper. They were authors on our protocol manuscript that was published. Each of our family members had funding to attend either an in-national meeting or an international meeting. Some of them came to the Canadian Critical Care Trials Group. Some of them are planning to attend when we present the full paper to be there in person. They've also been invited to speak at national and international meetings, and several of them have now participated on several research studies within the Canadian Critical Care Trials Group portfolio of research. And we plan to engage them in disseminating our FAST trial results. I would say that the most prominent role that they played in our trial was they changed our primary outcome, and there was lots of discussion about this. Our primary outcome was time to when patients would first be able to breathe on their own. That was all I could expect our interventions to do. And they told us it wasn't good enough, that it wasn't relevant, and that it wasn't patient and family important. And the whole steering committee took notice. We were all kind of alarmed that they didn't think it was relevant or important. But they were actually right. We went and did an interview-based study in the waiting rooms at several ICUs. And we explained different outcomes to members of the general public, family members who were visiting in the waiting rooms, and asked them to rate them on a Likert scale of importance. And they were right. So we learned a lot from them. So we actually changed our primary outcome. What I wanted to be the primary outcome is now a secondary outcome, and the time to being successfully liberated from the ventilator, which is what they preferred, is now our primary outcome of our trial. George, who's now since passed away, was a patient in our ICU. And he is a actor by trade and a singer. He studied at Trinity College in the University of London, received many awards as an actor. And he told me during one of our meetings that you saved my life, but you also ruined my life. I used to love to sing, and I was very good at it. It was my passion, but you trached me, and now I can't sing. He had a tracheostomy when he struggled to get off the ventilator in our ICU. And he told me in lay terms, you need to contact people 6 months or a year down the road and make sure that you left them better off. That looking at survival to ICU discharge or survival to hospital discharge was not adequate, which was our secondary outcomes. We had survival to hospital discharge as the most protracted outcome. And so as a result of George's comment, we added the 6-month follow-up study where we assessed quality of life and disability, so how well we left patients off. So I think they contributed in meaningful ways to our trial. They changed the primary outcome. They added an important follow-up study. They definitely provided new insights. And I think overall, they made the trial much more patient and family focused than the initial draft of the trial protocol. Another example that I can share with you, this is a real world perspective on clinical practice guidelines in gastroenterology. So there were 2 guidelines, the Canadian Association of Gastroenterology and the American College of Gastroenterology were working in parallel on guidelines looking at irritable bowel syndrome. The Canadian group included general practitioners, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, but also included patients. And the American College of Gastroenterology guideline was predominantly made up of academic gastroenterologists. And both guidelines in the end shared 14 statements with same or similar recommendations, but 10 statements they included in the Canadian guideline were not addressed by the American guideline, and 5 recommendations were actually in the opposite direction. And this was in large part attributed to the multidisciplinary engagement of the Canadian guideline, but also the input of patients who had irritable bowel syndrome and changing how the same evidence at the same point in time was interpreted in the recommendations that evolved from those meetings. So patient family engagement is a recent phenomenon in clinical research. This systematic review highlights that only about 5% of RCTs published in the top 3 medical journals now actually include patient and family advisors in either trial design or trial implementation. And mostly they're involved in the execution phase with only a few stakeholders involved in the dissemination phase. So we're still early in our learning curve about how to engage patients and families in clinical research and in clinical trials. As you know, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute in the US mandates stakeholder engagement in all of its funded research. They believe that patient research partners should possess core sets of competencies, which largely you have to train them in order to participate meaningfully in these endeavors, and that they have to align with the project's objective and the project's process. They acknowledge that engagement can take many forms and can occur at different phases in the research process. And they do mandate that advisory panels include patient and family advisors. And pretty well, the recommendation is that there's no hard number, but ideally, as many centers as you have participating, you should consider having patient and family partners. Now, that may be too numerous in multi-centered large trials. The core guiding principles are about trust, they're about co-learning, they're about reciprocity in relationships, so listening to what other people have to say, and mutual respect. Very simple. And this is their core model that has foundational elements that are both internal and external. They believe that those lead to actions that initiate and help maintain the partnership, and that those can affect near outcomes, intermediate outcomes, and long-term outcomes. So what about emerging guidelines for patient engagement in research? Well, the 6 best practices that have been highlighted in the research are the following: that we should develop organizational and institutional engagement policies, that we should cultivate attitudes that are supportive of researchers and patient research partnerships, recognizing that partnerships evolve over time, which has definitely been my experience. They're grounded in strong communication as well as shared goals. They adhere to principles of respect, trust, reciprocity, and co-learning, co-creation. That we as principal investigators or co-investigators need to understand that they have unique training needs, and we need to meet those training needs in order to enable them to meaningfully participate in discussions. And this involves identifying resources that they need or advanced planning, meeting with them ahead of a scheduled meeting to say, here are the issues that we need your help with. And here's the information that you need in order to think about these things and contribute in a meaningful way. And we need to recognize the value of these partnerships across all stages of research. There have been studies that have tried to, using systematic review methodology, identify foundational principles of patient stakeholder engagement in research and best practice activities. And again, they reiterate these same kind of best practices, worded differently, but the same best practices: providing training and education to patient and family stakeholders, respecting their opinion, listening to their opinion, having equitable power at meetings and allowing them to vote or allowing them to say, no, I disagree with that. Having regular bidirectional dialogue, such as in our trial where we met with them every 3 months, having equitable power between all team members, and having trust between patient stakeholders and researchers. So again, these 6 best practices, I think, ring true in most of the studies that I found. And this is a foundational framework that I think nicely depicts the engagement foundational principles, the respect and equity, trust, empowerment, the engagement best practices listed vertically, and then the integration across all research phases, including research design, research conduct or implementation, and then ultimately research dissemination. So what is the evidence related to engagement? Well, there's systematic reviews that have aimed to answer 4 key questions. What are the best ways to identify patient representatives? How do we engage them once we've identified them? What are the benefits? What are the barriers? And interestingly, they found that engagement was most commonly conducted at the beginning of research. So setting agenda, setting research priorities, helping with protocol development. There are no comparative analytic studies that recommend a particular method of identifying PRPs or engaging them. Patient engagement, however, has been shown in some studies to increase study enrollment rates, to aid researchers in securing funding, which I think was my case, They were helpful in designing protocols. In my case, they changed my primary outcome and added on a follow-up study, and definitely in choosing relevant outcomes, patient-important outcomes. The most commonly cited challenges in the systematic review were definitely related to logistics, so time and funding needed for engagement. I would say expertise as well, and worries related to tokenistic engagement. In our study, we looked at a cross-sectional questionnaire of ICUs across Canada, and we looked at engagement in patient care as well as in research in adult and in pediatric ICUs. We found that most commonly, research engagement included participation on ethics committees as a patient representative, protocol review, and in knowledge translation. The key facilitators that we identified was having support from leadership. So departmental and hospital leadership was key. The key barriers were time, resources, including the need to reimburse people for their time, and personnel with experience in engaging partners. And engagement was a much higher priority in pediatric, as you can imagine, with parents being much more advocates for their children versus in adult ICUs. And you can see here engagement in clinical care. There's an overall box in black. The lower blue box is in the adult ICUs, the higher blue box is in pediatric. And it was statistically significantly higher that parents engaged in their children's care in the ICU. Interestingly, engagement in research was also significantly higher in pediatric research versus in adult research. Not surprisingly, was higher in academic versus non-academic sites, and in university-affiliated versus non-university affiliated hospitals. There are umpteen tools that are out there. There are systematic reviews of, in this one, for example, in 2014, there were 34 toolkits that the authors identified to help researchers engage patients and families, and 17 different engagement models. However, not all toolkits are the same. The systematic review found that, interestingly, only 56% of the tools had a patient research partner engaged with them in developing them. Only 11% of them were explicitly based on literature reviews, and only 7% were tested for reliability. So they're not all the same. There have been multiple papers that have talked about the benefits of patient and family engagement on a more global perspective. This includes increasing the relevance of research questions and topics, so-called usability benefits, societal benefits, so more appropriate resource allocation and use of funding, ethical benefits, methodologic benefits. We have more appropriate timing and wording related to research interventions, increased readability and accessibility of research materials, benefits in terms of study quality, increased recruitment and retention of study participants. Also, greater protocol adherence has been cited in the literature. In addition, more diverse participants have also been noticed in trials that have included patient representatives. Instrumental benefits, including greater accuracy in measuring the needs and preferences of research partners, and study uptake benefits and development benefits. And as I highlighted before, the main barriers are financial, including the monetary cost of engagement. Current rates are about $50 per hour for patient or family partners, and the non-financial costs, including time, is the big one. So framework for organizational engagement, I really like this think, plan, do, share, use model. And you can see that this has across the top family advisors, who are people that you just contact for one specific focused research question. There are family partners that continually engage in your project, such as in clinical trials from the beginning to the end. And there are lived experience individuals, people that you want to hear their experience, and that's their way of participating. And that this can be integrated into the think, plan, do, share, use model based on the level of engagement of family members. This is the organizational approach that's used by the Holland Bloorview Research Institute. And again, it goes back to those same core guiding principles of inclusiveness, really encouraging co-creation, co-development, encouraging transparency of goals, expectations, and interactions. Support is key, supporting your patient and family partners so that they can contribute meaningfully, and mutual respect. And then finally, I'm just going to talk about a couple of frameworks for community engagement. There are really 9 core principles, if you will, best practices that have been highlighted for community engagement. And these include building on the strength and resources within an existing community already, empowering individuals in the community and sharing resources within the community, research and action for mutual benefit, as opposed to contributing to one investigator's trial, the promotion of co-learning and capacity building, emphasizing the local relevance and the ecological perspective, identifying the community itself as an identity to be studied or to be engaged with, system development through cyclical and iterative processes, and dissemination of findings involving all partners, as well as long-term commitments to the partnership. And the All of Us research program that was initiated by Barack Obama in January of 2015 really, I think, highlights nicely community engagement. And in this project, they aim to collect survey data, electronic health records, physical measurements, and biospecimens to build a large and diverse data set with a focus on precision medicine going forward in the future. The program's goal is to engage 1 million or more Americans from diverse social, racial, ethnic backgrounds and all age groups, with the expectation that they'll participate for 10 years or more, so a longitudinal participation. And the RAND researchers have been involved in tandem doing mixed method studies of participants and stakeholder engagement in this organization to define best practices for all of the regional medical centers that are participating. And this is really what they came up with as their recommendation to implement best practices and strategies for implementing these practices. To expand existing community partnerships, foster spectrums of leadership support, engage a mix of study champions within the regional medical centers, make precision medicine relevant to participant priorities, building an engagement team across those regional medical centers with diverse expertise, and being prepared to confront and talk about uncertainties openly as you're engaging your community members. They propose evaluating the 3 M's, which are markers, metrics, and mechanisms. Markers being possible and desired outcomes, are the equivalent of our clinical outcomes in trials. Metrics being features of engagement that might determine the outcomes. So really focusing on the process of how people are engaged, and mechanisms, so how engagement strategies can achieve intended outcomes. And this is really a nice framework, I think, for conducting community level engagement. Even in science, this is from the Ocean Observatories Initiative. They've highlighted best practices for engaging, and really it just breaks down research or engagement in research on a kind of step-by-step basis, engaging them in various aspects of planning and partnership development, looking at practices and giving examples of how we can engage individuals in the community, and then looking at how we can engage them in implementation, kind of parallel to what we do in clinical trials, and then ultimately engaging them in dissemination activities on the community level. And then finally, this is a metric that was developed to look at an intervention framework. So having an intervention strategy, and then whatever your community engagement program is, you can select from these implementation strategies. So adapting and tailoring, engaging consumers, providing interactive assistance, developing stakeholder interrelationships, financial strategies, training and education, and then you can monitor your outcomes from this. So as an example, capturing community perspectives, you can adapt and tailor to the context. You can develop stakeholder interrelationships. You can train and educate stakeholders. And you can do this for anything, even getting pilot funding for grants in this example. And it just shows how you can select certain implementation strategies when you engage in communities and research, and then your metrics can include implementation outcomes, such as the number of people that you've reached or how you build capacity, for example, across community partners, how you develop partnerships within your engagement, and importantly, how these have changed over time. And so really, in conclusion, I just want to say that patient and family engagement in research can really fundamentally change how we work and how we conduct our research and how we disseminate our research. For me, anyway, they provided new insights into a field that I thought I knew a lot about, but I didn't know what was important to them, what was important to the people that were ultimately going to be receiving the interventions. I think it makes our investments in research more accountable, and it helps really to ensure a strong patient and family focus in our research. I think in a broader sense that engagement approaches, whether it's individual researchers or within organizations or within communities, can serve as exemplars for us all for other forms of patient-centered outcomes research, and can help us focus on that. And definitely we need to do further work to identify the skills and the qualities and the approaches that best support effective patient-research relationships. So with that, I will conclude.
And what an amazing overview of a lot of very recent literature. I'm sure we all learned tons. Maybe we'll have a couple of questions or comments from the group and then go into our facilitated discussion.
Give us great principles. Thank you, Dr. This really insightful talk. Trying to think about how to apply this immediately to practical operations. So I'm not necessarily a patient, I'm a learner or a training. How did you decide who those patient representatives were for your study? These samples were so.
Mine was a North American trial, and so I personally identified people that I had longitudinal relationships with that, you know, had survived in our ICU or had been family members of patients in our ICU, and contacted them and explained what I was doing and asked if they might be interested in contributing. I must admit, I selected people that I thought were thoughtful, that were articulate, that I kind of thought that they would do very well in terms of speaking up and contributing to, you know, the research enterprise, a study design. I engaged my colleagues to identify people that they knew. So some of my research partners were from the US. We regularly met over Zoom. It didn't really, that wasn't an impediment. I think that actually enriched the dialogue. So there were people that I didn't know and that I brought in to the research program, explaining what we were trying to do. For me, the key part was if they all had experience, either directly or indirectly through a family member, of somebody trying to get off the ventilator. And so they knew that struggle. They knew what it was to either be going through extubation or failing breathing trials, or being trached and struggling to get off the ventilator, or watching their loved one in that scenario. So they had a very specific relationship with the topic that I was researching, and were very invested from the beginning. Actually, one of them said to me when I needed to get her to sign a form for a grant that was submitted, I had to fax it to her. She's not very computer literate. And she said to me, you know, Dr. Burns, I'm not your girl. If this is going to involve like high-tech stuff, like, and I thought, wow, I'm faxing to a UPS office to get you to sign this, whatever, what have I done? And she ended up being the most vocal and is a key member of our Canadian Critical Care Trials Group Patient and Family Partnership Committee. She ended up being the most vocal of the person that I thought would be the least vocal, ended up being the most vocal. But they were really empowered. One of them sat on several patient and family commitments, had several patient and family commitments, both at an organizational level at Johns Hopkins, as well as individual research studies, sat on about 10 committees, and was really a professional patient partner. He himself had been in the ICU, and his wife had passed away in the ICU. And so he had a lot of things to say about ICU level care. So they each brought their own experience and expertise. I saw my role mainly as a facilitator, that I met with them regularly. I educated them on research. Well, this is how, this is how the clinical trials enterprise works. And they contributed a lot in terms of what they knew from their lens that I clearly didn't know. Yeah, I think for me, I found that I had to empower some people to find their voice. And I would say, oh, what do you think about that, Susan? What do you think, blah, blah, blah. And I would just give her the floor in the space to talk, because the dynamics are that the most verbal people will generally occupy the most amount of space in the meeting or in the Zoom call. But calling on people or, taking turns or whatever and getting different perspectives, I found very helpful. But I also found the more that I did that, the more they were empowered to speak up on their own. And we developed a friendship, where we would email each other and kind of keep in touch over email, or, hey, when's our next meeting? Or what am I supposed to be doing in preparation for the next meeting? It was kind of that type of, and it went on for 5-6 years. It's still going on now. And several of them have moved on and become patient partners, research partners in other research programs. So I think they found that they do have something to contribute, like they found their own voice and they found that they could contribute. And some of the Americans come to our Canadian meetings regularly. I think she attended more meetings than me during the pandemic, actually. But, I think just valuing what they have to say, however they're going to say it, is really important. And listening, right? When they told me my primary outcome was irrelevant, I must admit I had to take a big breath and I thought, you know what, maybe they're right. Maybe they are right. Maybe this is only relevant to me and my ICU colleagues, and but maybe they're right. Maybe this is not the right outcome for the trial, right? Well, it's just being written up now. I don't know that I can say that. I don't know that I can share that, but I will say that that was not part of the trial protocol when we initially developed it. There was no follow-up study. As is typical for many of our ICU studies, we follow people to hospital discharge. Sometimes we follow them longer, 6 months mortality or 180 days. I wouldn't say that's the case for all of our studies. But, the real question, did we leave patients better off, is an important one. Clearly, it was important to George, and he was very, very vocal, using his own words in saying, thank you, but this is not enough. Like, you can't just help people to survive when you've changed their lives irrevocably forever going forward.